Okay, so here we are with M Turbo Reverb. Now, I'm very impressed with this reverb. I really feel it brings something different to the table. I'm a reverb connoisseur, so I take a real interest in the reverbs that are out there. This reverb brings so much with it. This is the thing. It's got two big things going for it from my perspective. One, it sounds really realistic. I mean, the sense of space that it can create is quite remarkable. I mean, really, the space opens out on some of the patches, or many of the patches, the space opens out right behind the speakers. Really sounds like it's in a real space. And a lot of reverbs don't manage that very well. If a reverb can do that, I immediately think, oh, this is on the high end of reverbs, because it's not that easy. So that's one of the things that this does really well, but it is so flexible. You can do everything from a very realistic room or hall to plates and springs and way out into all sorts of sound design territory. So there's literally nowhere that this reverb doesn't seem capable of going. And if you're a real tweaker, you can go very, very deep with this, deeper than any other reverb, as far as I can tell, on the market. Now, I'm somebody that wants to be able to turn some knobs and understand what things do, so I'm not going to be somebody that's messing with the underlying code, but it's there if you want to, which is just quite amazing. So I'm going to have a walk through here, and we're going to have a listen to some of the sounds. So before we get started, if you can like the video and subscribe, that's really helpful to me and really appreciated. And let's first look at the two main screens. You've got the presets here, and it's arranged like Melda is going more in this direction now, where they're giving you a GUI with knobs and buttons and things, because a lot of people just find that an easier way to work. And traditionally, Melda had this kind of common GUI that all of their plugins shared, which was very very flexible and very deep, but not so easy to just go in and tweak the basic things you need. It was like everything was there possible you could ever want, even though you might only want 3 of the controls most of the time, and it wasn't everybody's preferred way of working. I include myself in that. I want to be able to just, in terms of the time I have when mixing, I don't have a huge amount of time to sit and tweak. I need to get a sound that's going to work for the mix and then move on, because obviously time's money, and you just can't, I don't have the time, as much as it might be fun to sit there and tweak every plugin that comes my way for hours and hours. I just need something that's going to sound really great out of the box, and then I can just move the few parameters, key parameters that I know I'm going to need. And Melda seems to be making a change, or has made a change already, towards that idea. So all the tweaking is there if you want it, but they've also got this nice GUI now, which allows you to just grab all the most useful parameters, or commonly used, I should say. They've also got a very nice preset system here, where it's just on the left here, and you can just select from different categories, and within each one you've got a bunch of patches. So if I click on these different patches, I'm going to get a slightly different GUI and a very different sound. But within each sound, you have sort of sub patches, I would call them. They're changes to the algorithm within this section here. So if you see when I click on here, I've got a bunch of different options here. Hydrogen, if I choose chlorine, it's going to change the sound, and I can go this way as well with these. And each of these changes the character of the sound significantly. It's a different space, a different sounding algorithm, but all within this general idea. So if you think of each of these has that, each of them is like a completely different world, in terms of sound from each other. But within each of those, you've got a lot of sub categories. You've got a lot of I don't know if these are actually sub-algorithms, whether they're actually completely different reverb algorithms, or whether they're just other kinds of tweaks. They're basically tweaks under the hood that really change the sound significantly. So that gives you an amazing, if you look at all of the basic patches here, all that have these sub-patches in a sense within them, and then I move to the next one, and you can see there's more here, and there's a lot. So now each of these shares similar controls. They're not all the same. Sometimes you click on one, it will change some of the controls that are available, as well as just the kind of look of it. But most of them share pretty much the same thing. So I'm just going to go through these. But before that, I think we should just have a quick listen to the general quality of this thing. Just so you can get an idea of how it sounds. I'm going to solo up the snare. I'm not going to spend ages on this yet. I'm just going to give you a general idea so you can hear the quality of it, and then we'll look at the parameters, and then I'll go more into some of the different presets. So let's start with the snare on a hall. So those are just a few almost random selections of what this can do. These are actually patches I made, which are just tweaks on patches that are in here. If you're listening on speakers anyway, you should be able to hear the sense of space you get from this thing is right up there with the best ones in terms of realism of actual 3D space happening. It's really great on that front. So let's now that we've had a look at that. Let's have a look at. Sorry, a quick listen to that. Let's have a look at the controls that we get on most of these patches. So starting at the top here, we've got a high pass on the sides. So as I turn this up, I am going to be high passing just the sides. So you're kind of monoing the low frequencies. Then I've got a normal overall high pass. Over on the right, you've got a low pass on the mids. So you're going to be pulling the mids down as you move this down, and it's going to leave the sides untouched. So if you want to kind of have a widening thing that moves out the way of the things in the center, that'd be something you could use for that. And you've got just a general high pass here. Then these are just kind of just EQs here, bass and treble, just does what it says. Pre-delay, hopefully we all know what that is. We've got our algorithms change here, which you can click on and see the whole list, and the list is different for every one of these basic main presets. And you can also move through clicking here. I kind of wish that the click area here was a bit bigger, because you got to get right on that little tiny triangle. If you're slightly off of it, you'll bring up that list, and that's a bit irritating, but it's just if they could just maybe make it that size, it would be a lot easier to use these arrows. But that's a very small quibble. So we've got dry wet, and if you notice here, that little lock is red. If you click on this, it will lock it, so when you change presets, it's not going to change this particular parameter. A number of these parameters have that, which is really, really useful. Early late mix, like, there's a late reflections to the tail, in other words, and the early reflections, you can decide on the mix between those. The overall length of the reverb and the overall size of the room, which you can lock, which is great. Then it's got saturation, so it adds saturation to the signal. Really nice to have. Overall gain for the reverb. Distance, just really useful to have. Not all the patches have this, but the ones that do, really useful. It gives you a sense of how distant the room is, the distance from of the object in the room. So, moving down here, early reflections, you've got the length of it, the amount of diffusion it has, that meaning like how discrete the echoes of the early reflections are as opposed to kind of how diffused sounding they are, less kind of obviously discrete echoes. I'm not sure what the form is. Widening is what you'd expect it to be. It widens the early reflection, the sense of the size of the room. Early reflections are a lot to do with what gives you the size of the immediate room around you. Modulation in the early reflections and cross modulation, this is to do with the input signal and whether the stereo of the input signal is sent to both sides of the reverb, stereo reverb, or not. Same thing on the late side, except you've got damping, low and high damping. These I find a little bit unintuitive in the way that they work. I mean, they're great. What they do is great, but it's like as you turn this down, it damps the highs. I'll show you what I mean. It kind of feels like they should move the opposite way around, but you get used to it. And what these do is they're not EQs, they actually change the dampening within the algorithm itself of low and high frequencies on the reflections. Then you've got a pre-delay here. Complexity, it just changes the ups or downs the complexity of the reverb, which can be really useful. I generally find that the more complexity, the smoother it can sound in some situations. Sometimes it also can make it more dense, and less complexity can sound sometimes a little more grainy and less smooth, but also can, if you've got very harmonic material, it can make it sound more beautiful sounding. So this kind of, I always like these kind of controls when you get them on, they sometimes have different names, but this kind of control I find is, yeah, super important, because sometimes you've got the reverb and it's nice, but it just needs a little bit more. It needs to sing a bit more with a musical tonal instrument, or it needs a little bit more smoothness if you've got like a snare smashing into it or whatever, percussion. Modulation, pretty clear. Hopefully we know what that is. You can modulate the tail, and the same thing with the cross stereo, left and right on the input. Then you've got a dynamic section here with gate and compression. And that's pretty straightforward. You can get gated reverbs and you can compress the reverb. And presumably you can get ducking with this, although I haven't actually tried doing that, as I don't tend to use ducking all that much. But some people find it super useful. So then we got what the detector, what causes the detector to work, whether it's the dry input, the reverb itself, I guess, or the side chain that you could set up. Okay, so that's the basic controls. Now I'm going to go and look at the other part of the GUI. If you click on Edit here, then you get this. And you've got a whole bunch of tabs along here, all of which can be used. Right now we've got 3 of them being used because you can see they're lit up. You've got early reflections, which you can see these are the early reflections, and you can actually change them and move them. And there's a bunch of parameters here around that, some of which will be linked to these controls here. So these controls are basically changing parameters on this page, and you can see that by moving them on the other page and coming back and looking at this, you can see that some of them have moved. So if we click now, so there's a whole bunch of different parameters here, which I'm not going to go into because there's just so much here. And I can't pretend that I know what all of these things do, because it's extremely deep, and it goes even deeper as we start going into here, the late reflections, the tail, where you get a whole bunch of other parameters here, some of which are fairly straightforward, but some of which I don't know what they do, particularly when you come down here. So, I mean, these are, fairly straightforward, and some of these, you can see, are linked to the front, the other side of the GUI. But then down here, you've got here an actual algorithm here that's written in, and you can write your own ones in there. And they're based on the underlying code within this plugin, which is incredibly flexible. And if you want to get into that side of things, there's a whole huge thing about this on the website that explains it. And you can make your own reverbs from, well, I don't know if you're making them from scratch or making them from the built-in building blocks of M Turbo Reverb. So there is like vast capability if you wanted to go and design your own reverbs. Not something I'm going to do. I'm not a coder, and as I said, I don't have the time for getting into anything like that. But here you have, within that algorithm, you've got a bunch of different parameters, not all of which I understand. In fact, most of them I don't understand. But one of them that is useful is this pitch shift one. If you want to move the pitch up and get like an octave up or down, you can do that here. Some of the presets have that linked to the front page. And there's all kinds of other stuff. You can seed things. I'm not sure exactly what that is. I think it creates a random variation. I may be wrong about that. It's something around that. But basically, this is deep. There is a huge amount of stuff going on in here. And it's not a page I'm going to spend a lot of time on, I have to be honest. I'm going to be on this page most of the time. And I might very occasionally go in there. And if I want to try to change something which I understand, which isn't on this front page. So let's move on now to having a listen to some more of the sounds. And I'm going to go over to some rooms here and have a listen to those. So just, taking this one preset is a preset I made, but it's very much based on one of the built-in presets that I made a few tweaks to. So quickly I can move from that to something really different. So I think that's the other thing about this that I really like, is that these controls are just so well implemented. Like, the changes you get are transformative. They're not just like a subtle change. They really change the whole character of the thing, but in a really good way, in a way that makes sense. So it was I thought, I want to get something that sounds like, I've got a nice room here. I want to get something that's shorter and kind of really kind of low-endy, kind of a bit more, I don't know if grungy is the right word, but, something that sounds a bit more like a lower-fi room. Not lo-fi is the wrong word, actually. More like a room that's not ideal. But something that you might get drums recorded in a slightly grungier context. So I boosted up, removed the low dampening, pulled back on the high dampening, moved the size of the room down, and before you know it, you're really getting that to happen, and brought up this saturation, and before you know it, it's starting to sound quite quickly and easily into what I had in my head. So now I'll move over to some plates. So again, a huge range of different hall sounds, all of which sound really not just like, yeah, they've got very long tails on them, ridiculously long tails, but again, just for demonstration purposes. But you hear how it opens out 3D back behind the speakers in a way that most reverbs really struggle to do. So yeah, really great on that front. So let's have a listen to this in context. And I'll again go through some presets, just so you can hear what the snare sounds like with different reverbs on it in terms of the space and so forth and how it sits in the mix. So I'll just start with some plates and then I'll move on from there. So you can hear really sound great in a mix. Huge amount of variety. Everything from the, you know, real kind of low end kind of solidity and weight to airy kind of spacious reverbs. So let's move on now to listening to it on another instrument, something completely different than listening to it on saxophone. Okay, so now we've got sax, and we're going to have a look at a somewhat different side of this reverb. I mentioned earlier that it extends way out into sound design as well as, you know, the more normal sounding reverbs. So this is based on one of the presets here, and I'm going to play the sax through this and just have a listen to what this does. So a really lovely ethereal sound design type reverb. Start messing with some of the controls. And you've got all sorts going on there. Now what's interesting about this one is if I change, listen to what happens if I change to these different sub presets or sub algorithms. You get quite a different sound, but also you get a strange sound when you jump between them. It's actually in itself kind of cool. But I was just going to mention one other thing here that's really nice, is that if you click reload here, it will reload the preset from scratch. Whereas otherwise, if I've changed some of these settings and I go and move to these other kind of, whatever these are, sub-algorithm things, it keeps these controls, some of these controls the same, some of them it will change. I haven't quite figured out why some of these stay the same and some change, but if you just want to bring it back to the and even if you go, this is something again which is a little quirky, and I'm not quite sure what I think about it, but if I move to another preset and come back to this, it will have remembered what I've done. So it's useful, I think, in that situation to have a complete reload of the preset here, which is what that does, that button up there. Okay, a little bit more on this and then we'll move on. So really quite a very beautiful ethereal sound design thing, and we've got others in here. Let's have a listen to this one. And again, lots of variations in there. Let's move over now to this one. This is a nice one. So really resonant. It's a film orchestra is the name of the patch, and J Bond here obviously gives you that kind of huge orchestral kind of sound, which is like huge and exaggerated compared to what you normally get in most reverbs for kind of orchestral settings. But you can easily pull back on it. And what's nice about this is that it's really, you listen to what it does with the tones of the saxophone. Just have a listen to how it kind of sort of naturally sustains and supports the tone, which is something that's really hard to find in a reverb that also can do great space. So there are reverbs out there that are really good at supporting the tone of an instrument. Oftentimes some vintage reverbs can do this, or sort of specialist sound design reverbs can be really good at doing this, but typically those reverbs are not so good at creating a realistic space. And the ones that can create really realistic spaces are typically not as good, in my experience, of sort of supporting the tone in that sort of almost like sustaining the notes way. And this one can do both those things. And this particular patch is really good at doing that. Have a listen to how it sort of sustains the notes and kind of keeps them going, in a sense, supports them. You hear what I mean? It's the actual tone that's sustaining. Yet it has a sense of size and space. I mean, some of the other patches, you know, that don't do this also have that, but it's capable of doing both at the same time, which is, in my experience, pretty rare. So again, lots of variations in here, all sounding really great. So let's move on here. I'm going to have a look in here. We've got some shimmer reverbs. Have a look at this. So some very nice shimmer reverbs. And then I'm just going to jump over to some halls here. So a huge amount of variety there, beautiful sounds for instruments like sax, or really any instrument. So I can't recommend this thing enough. It is a brilliant sounding reverb and hugely flexible, more than any other reverb out there that I've ever seen by quite a long way. Or you can just, you know, treat it in a very kind of easy to understand basic way as well. It's super deep, deepest reverb that I've ever seen. Or you can just treat it like a normal reverb in terms of just all the controls that you'd ever need plus some. It's amazing on all those different levels. So if you're into high-end sounding reverbs and you've got cinematic rooms and you've got Seventh Heaven and a few others like that, you should have a look at this one, have a listen to this one, because it's right up there with those really great sounding ones. It sounds fantastic and brings a whole different set of things to the table. So I hope you found this useful. If you did, please do give the video a like, and please subscribe. That's really helpful to me. If you can just press the subscribe button, and if you can press the thanks button, that's really helpful too for keeping the channel going, and hope to see you next time.